We are following major breaking news out of Ottawa, where 6 Indian diplomats, including India's High Commissioner, are being expelled from Canada. That move follows a warning from the RCMP, who allege the Modi government is not only involved in a deep criminal conspiracy, but it's becoming more brazen.
While attempts have been made by the RCMP and national security officials to work with the government of India and Indian law enforcement counterparts on this matter, they have been repeatedly refused. This is why, this weekend, Canadian officials took an extraordinary step. They met with Indian officials to share RCMP evidence which concluded 6 agents of the government of India are persons of interest in criminal activities. And despite repeated requests to the government of India, it has decided not to cooperate.
The RCMP says agents of the Indian government are linked to crimes like homicide, extortion, and other acts of violence on Canadian soil. That led to the unprecedented move from the federal government. And in response, India is expelling 6 Canadian diplomats, including the acting High Commissioner. It's calling the claims, quote, baseless and unacceptable. Canada's relations with India have been tense ever since Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused the Indian government of playing a role in the murder of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. CBC's Sarah Galashan has more on this story from Vancouver, British Columbia. And Sarah, in many ways, this story actually begins in that province where you are. What are you hearing?
In some ways, Stephanie, it does. I mean, if you think back to events in BC more than a year ago, that really is what has led us to this point right now. And Kate, there, you heard her mention the name Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Back in June 2023, that is when he was shot to death outside his place of worship in Surrey, British Columbia. He was part of the pro-Khalistan movement, a group, a movement that advocates for a separate Sikh state within India. All the while he and others like him are living in another country, in Canada, and afforded the protections that Canada provides. But before their efforts for Khalistan, India's government has in some cases labeled them as terrorists. What we are hearing today from the Canadian government, not so different from the allegations that were made by Nijjar's associates back in June 2023. But let me play you what they told us today.
For us as in the Sikh community is something that is very terrifying, in the sense that you have people who are supposed to be, who come from a diplomatic country, who come from a country that is run under democracy, but those officials are being used to link up with active organized crimes that are connected back to India, to go on and to eliminate, to target and kill Sikhs here in Canada who are advocating for a self-determination in the form of Khalistan.
The murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar led to an investigation that has expanded, has spread across the country, resulted in 4 arrests related to his murder back in May. And throughout this process, subsequently, the RCMP said that they have learned more about alleged links to India's government, accusing them and resulting in the Canadian government expelling diplomats for essentially orchestrating violent acts within Canada. And much of that happening within the province of British Columbia. And so it was not really a surprise today that BC's Premier David Eby was among the first to come out reacting to this news. Let me play you what he said.
It's profoundly disturbing to me, and I know to so many British Columbians. Federal investigative teams will continue to work with the BC RCMP and local police to ensure that those involved are held responsible. They have, of course, assured me that that will be the case. British Columbia will continue to ensure that our police have all of the resources they need to get to the bottom of this and hold those involved accountable.
Now, among the violent acts that the RCMP are talking about, they're using the word homicides, not homicide, homicides, so plural, so more than just Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who we have talked about there. So if it's plural, that has raised some questions about the murder of Rapudaman Singh Malik. He was gunned down outside of his office, his business office in Surrey, British Columbia, and that was in 2022. Now, he was someone well known for his feelings about Khalistan and within the Khalistan movement after he was acquitted of mass murder in the Air India bombing. And that bombing, of course, killed 331 people. The Foreign Affairs Minister was asked about this at the press conference, whether or not evidence related to his death, his murder, was some of what informed what they have against the diplomats that have now been expelled. And the Foreign Affairs Minister would not confirm that, saying that leave it to the RCMP to discuss. But Stephanie, what we do know is that Malik's son, just last May, was issued what they call a duty to warn by the RCMP, meaning they had credible evidence that his life was at threat.
Okay, so still some unanswered questions on that case in BC. But Sarah, there are other really large Sikh communities in places outside of BC, including where I am in Ontario. So what kind of reaction have we heard from these other Sikh communities?
Yeah, a particularly large diaspora in Brampton, Ontario. And we had our cameras out there speaking with representatives of that community about their concerns, their fears right now. Take a listen.
These persons of interest that have been named should be formally charged. And there are a lot of Sikh leaders in our community that have been given duty to warrants. I think their safety and security should be made a priority, and they should be protected at any cost.
Yeah, the World Sikh Organization in Canada also spoke with us and talked about the fact that they understand that these diplomats have diplomatic immunity, although also would like to see them face charges. And they also talked about the fact that despite the fact that there has been this expelling of 6 diplomats, that they don't believe that the community is necessarily any more safe. Take a listen.
The fact of the matter is that the Indian consulates and embassies, they have their people on the ground. They have people that they work through. So those networks are still intact. So will it have a major impact on the violence facing Sikhs? I have my doubts.
To that, we have heard reassurances from Peel Police, from the RCMP, and as well from the Premier of British Columbia that this is an ongoing RCMP investigation and that they will continue to provide the security that they deem to be necessary for these particular communities. Stephanie?
CBC's Sarah Galashan. Thank you, Sarah.
You bet.
Let's stay on this story, and for more analysis, we'll bring in Wesley Wark. He's a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and he joins us from Ottawa. Thank you so much for being here, Wesley.
Good evening, Stephanie.
So let's start with your reaction. What do you make of the RCMP's accusations against these Indian diplomats?
Well, it was certainly an extraordinary day for the RCMP to give a press conference of this kind with as much detail as they provided. In the midst of what they said is an ongoing investigation is really unprecedented. And then, of course, it was matched by the diplomatic expulsions that Canada announced and the tit-for-tat expulsions that India announced. So really an incredible day. And I think it is really a result on the Canadian side from frustration that it was experiencing in terms of trying to deal with the Indian government, present the evidence to them, get them to respond, get them to back off in terms of some of their interference into Canada. You heard from Prime Minister Trudeau at the top of your program. I think you could hear that frustration, and particularly the reference to this mission that was sent to Singapore after the ASEAN summit that comprised the Deputy Commissioner for the RCMP, the National Security Intelligence Advisor, and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, who went to Singapore to meet with Indian counterparts and say, here's the evidence we have. We need to see some cooperation from you. And they got nothing from that. I think that really forced the government's hand in terms certainly of their diplomatic expulsions. And from the RCMP's perspective, I think what we heard from the Commissioner, Michael Duhem, was really a growing sense of concern about the fact that despite the reality, the RCMP has been investigating this threat for at least since February, when they put this task force together, February 2024, that they were seeing the threats continue, concerns continue to grow about the possibility of violence occurring. And in their press conference, I think what they were truly trying to do is send a message to the Indian government to stop this, and they want to break the chain between Indian diplomats and their proxies in Canada, in particular criminal gangs who are carrying out, apparently, the orders of Indian government officials.
They use the words disrupting a lot, disrupting that chain, as you say. You know, when we think about the other countries that Canada has suspected of foreign interference, countries like Russia or Iran, they don't necessarily share really close diplomatic ties with Canada. On the other hand, we have India, whose diplomatic relationship with our country is very long, spans 75 years. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly, she described it in that press conference as, you know, she said there are deep person-to-person ties between these two countries. How does that complicate the situation here?
Well, I think, from the Canadian government's perspective, they would like to see a resolution of this. And in the RCMP commissioner's own press conference, he really sort of suggested there was a way forward in terms of cooperation, recognizing that there may be indeed extremist elements within the Sikh community in Canada that would be of concern to Canada on a national security basis and is a concern to India. So trying to, offer some ground for a way forward. But first, they need the cooperation of the Indian government in terms of investigations into events that have taken place so far. So, there's certainly a desire. We heard this from the foreign minister. Certainly, a desire for Canada to maintain good relations with India, but also a clear expression of the fact that those good relations cannot continue on the present kind of basis where the Indian government feels it has free rein to engage in these kinds of interference activities in Canada.
What do today's revelations say to you about the extent of foreign interference in general in this country?
I think every case is different. I mean, we have grown to understand a lot more about Indian foreign interference through the public inquiry, the foreign interference inquiry that's underway, and identification of India as the number 2 threat to Canada, next to India, as identified in a committee report from the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. So we've seen a kind of shift in emphasis in a way from China, which has been our principal concern and will be an ongoing concern to this closer look at what the Indian government has been up to over the last few years.
After everything we heard today, one of the outstanding questions is still, and we understand that the RCMP is still investigating, but one of the outstanding questions is what kind of charges will be laid. Our federal government said today that India was not cooperating. So given the scope of what's being alleged here, how difficult will it be to actually impose consequences on those who are found to be involved in anything like this?
Well, it's a good question, Stephanie. I mean, there are two answers to that. One is that to the extent that the Indian government is relying on proxies of various kinds operating within Canada, whether there are kind of willing accomplices in foreign interference schemes or criminal gangs, and the Bishnoi gang in particular was actually referenced in the RCMP press conference, to the extent that there are individuals that can be identified and evidence can be acquired about their activities that are criminal in nature, they can be brought to trial. It's a separate story in terms of trying to bring Indian officials to trial. You can certainly lay charges against Indian officials, whether they're diplomats who've been expelled from Canada or officials back in New Delhi or elsewhere in India. Very difficult, of course, to bring them to justice, but there's always a symbolic value in doing that. It's a calculation in terms of, cost and benefit to Canada-India relations. But I think the principal focus is going to be on trying to identify those proxy actors for the Indian government operating within Canada and bring them to trial.
Wesley Wark, thank you so much for the time.